She wasn't missing when they said she was missing. She was missing long before that. And that difference, that gap between when it happened and when anyone admitted it, that is the crack this entire case falls through. Here is what the public was told. Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Her family reported her gone. Authorities responded. A search began. Here is what the evidence says. By the time any of that happened, the clock had already run out. Think about what that actually means. Someone knew she was gone before the call was made. Someone had already made a decision. And by the time investigators arrived, they weren't walking into a disappearance. They were walking into the aftermath of one. An aftermath that had already been arranged. Hi viewers, here is a question that has been sitting with this case from the very beginning, and nobody has answered it cleanly yet. If you noticed someone you lived with was missing, how many hours would pass before you picked up the phone? Drop your answer in the comments. Because that number, that personal, honest number, is exactly what makes this case so hard to look away from. Back to Nancy. Neighbors would later describe Nancy Guthrie as present but distant. The kind of woman who smiled when she passed you on the driveway, who waved from the porch, who never let a conversation go deep enough to matter. People assumed that was just her personality. Private, reserved, the kind of quiet that belongs to someone who simply values their space. But there is a difference between privacy and isolation. Privacy is a choice. Isolation is something done to a person. And most people, most good, well-meaning people, never notice which one they are looking at until it is already too late. So when Nancy stopped appearing, nobody rushed, nobody panicked, because her absence looked exactly like her presence always had. Quiet, unremarkable, easy to explain away. That was the first problem. The second problem was worse. When investigators began pulling the timeline, the real timeline, not the one they were handed, something did not sit right. The sequence of events that Nancy's inner circle provided was clean. Too clean. Every detail accounted for. Every question pre-answered. Every gap filled before it could be noticed. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos and his team call that a red flag. Not because people in shock can't be articulate. Some people get sharper under pressure. But there is a specific kind of sharpness that comes from preparation, from rehearsal, from knowing what questions are coming because you already decided what the answers would be. That is not grief. That is management. And somewhere in the middle of those early conversations, a phrase surfaced. Casual, quiet, almost forgettable. Family plan. It was used to explain something about communication, about why certain people were notified before others, about why the timeline moved the way it did. It sounded reasonable in the moment, responsible even, the kind of thing families do when they want to handle something carefully. But Sheriff Chris Nanos wrote it down. Investigators always write down the phrases that sound too reasonable, because when they looked closer at everything surrounding that phrase, the timing, the sequence, the people involved, they realized something that changed the direction of this entire case. Something wasn't being hidden. It was being managed. And managed situations don't happen by accident. Someone built this. Someone planned the response before the response was ever needed. And the question that was now sitting at the center of every interview, every record request, every location ping investigators pulled, was not where Nancy Guthrie was. The question was, who already knew? Every morning, without fail, Nancy Guthrie moved through her Catalina Foothills home with the quiet certainty of a woman who had built her life exactly the way she wanted it. 84 years old, sharp, grounded, the kind of woman whose routines were not habits born from age. They were choices made from decades of knowing exactly who she was and what she valued. She kept a garden. She had her standing appointments. She answered her phone when her daughters called, because that was simply what Nancy did. She was present in the way that people who have lived fully tend to be present, not loud about it, but consistent, reliable, there. Her daughter Annie Guthrie and Annie's husband Tommaso Cioni were the last people to see Nancy before she vanished. They would later be cleared by law enforcement, a detail that matters, a detail that shapes how this case gets understood. But in those first hours, before the clearing, before the full picture emerged, investigators needed to understand everything about the last moments Annie and Tommaso had with Nancy. What was her mood? Her energy? Did anything seem off? The answers came back the way answers always come back when people are trying to be helpful, imprecise, and honest all at the same time. She seemed fine. That word again, fine. The word that gets used when someone was present enough to observe, but not close enough to see. And then there was Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter, television anchor, a woman whose name and face are known across the country, which meant that when Nancy disappeared, the story did not stay quiet for long. Savannah went public. She offered a $1 million reward for information leading to her mother's safe return. $1 million. That number does not come from a family that is managing a situation quietly. That number comes from desperation, from love, from a daughter who understood that public pressure and public attention were now the most powerful tools available. She always checked in with her mother, except the calls stopped being answered, and that was the first thing that didn't fit. Here is what matters about Nancy Guthrie at 84 years old, living in the Catalina foothills, with a life built on routine and connection, and the specific, irreplaceable rhythm of a woman who knew her people and kept them close. She was not the kind of woman who disappeared quietly, which means her disappearance was not quiet. It was made to look that way. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, who has analyzed this case publicly, made a point that cuts through everything else. She noted that in abduction cases involving elderly victims, the window between disappearance and report is almost always the most critical variable. Not the evidence collected later, not the forensic work, the window. Because what happens in that window, who makes decisions, who stays silent, who picks up the phone and who does not, shapes everything that follows. When Nancy Guthrie's routine broke, the window opened, and the people closest to her had to make choices about what to do with it. Because when her routine broke, no one treated it like an emergency, and that delay did not just slow the investigation, it changed what was still possible. Around February 1st, 2026, that is the window. That is when Nancy Guthrie was taken from her Catalina foothills home. Not a specific minute captured on a neighbor's doorbell camera. Not a clean timestamp logged by a witness with no reason to lie. A window, a range, the kind of timeline that exists when the people who were present in those hours did not immediately produce a precise account, and when the people who should have been raising alarms were, for reasons that investigators are still pulling apart, not raising them. Tommaso Cioni and Annie Guthrie were the last to see her. They were cleared, that is a fact. But cleared does not mean irrelevant. Cleared means law enforcement determined they were not responsible for what happened to Nancy. It does not erase the fact that they occupy the final confirmed hours of her presence in that house. It does not erase the questions investigators had to ask, carefully, methodically, the way Sheriff Chris Nanos's team approaches every layer of a case this complex. Who saw her last? What was the state of the house when they left? And why did the timeline between their last contact with Nancy and the official report to law enforcement contain the space that it did? Stop for a second. Think about what that space means. Now layer in what came next. A text message sent to Annie Guthrie, not from a family friend, not from a neighbor checking in, from a man named Derek Kallela, a former Los Angeles County employee who made contact regarding ransom. Ransom. That word changes the shape of everything, because a ransom communication means someone believed they could monetize Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Someone believed that Savannah Guthrie's public profile, her television visibility, her $1 million reward announcement created an opportunity. Someone calculated that the combination of a high-profile family and a missing 84-year-old woman was a transaction waiting to happen. Derek Colella reached out to Annie. That text exists. Investigators have it. And the question that immediately follows, the question that Sheriff Chris Nanos's office and the FBI began working simultaneously, is whether Colella was connected to the actual abduction or whether he was an opportunist who saw a public story and inserted himself into it for reasons that had nothing to do with knowing where Nancy actually was. Both possibilities are being investigated. Neither one is comfortable. Because if Colella was connected, if the ransom text was not opportunism, but communication from inside the operation, then Nancy Guthrie was not taken randomly. She was taken by people who already had an exit strategy. People who knew that a family with resources and a daughter with a national platform would pay to get her back. And if he was an opportunist, if he inserted himself into a family's worst nightmare for personal gain, then the real perpetrators are still a separate question entirely. The timeline didn't break, it bent. It bent around a ransom text that arrived before law enforcement had publicly confirmed the full scope of what they were dealing with. It bent around a communication that suggested someone outside the immediate family circle had specific knowledge of the situation, or was willing to exploit the appearance of that knowledge. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer was direct when she weighed in publicly. In abduction cases, she explained, ransom contact in the early window is one of the most significant behavioral signals investigators track. It tells you something about motive. It tells you something about who is watching the public response. And it tells you something about how much the people behind the disappearance believe the family will protect the situation rather than fully expose it. That last part, how much they believe the family will protect the situation. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with when you are looking at a case where the phrase family plan surfaced in the first wave of early explanations, offered smoothly, offered early, offered in the specific tone of something that had been decided before investigators arrived. Because when timelines are adjusted, when they are shaped rather than recalled, it is never to find the truth. It is to protect something that cannot survive the truth being found. And what investigators were about to uncover would prove that the timeline was only the beginning. The evidence was already waiting. It had been waiting the entire time. The FBI moved on the Catalina Foothills case, and Brian Entin reported it. That is not a small detail. Brian Entin, the News Nation reporter who has tracked missing persons cases with the kind of precision that makes law enforcement sources trust him with what they are not yet ready to say officially, Brian Entin reported FBI activity connected to the search for Nancy Guthrie. When the FBI moves on a missing persons case, it means the jurisdictional calculation has shifted. It means the case has crossed lines, geographic lines, evidentiary lines, or complexity lines that place it beyond the standard operational capacity of a single county sheriff's office. It means Sheriff Chris Nanos's team, which had been leading the ground investigation, was now working alongside federal resources. That escalation is not routine. That escalation means something was found. Forensic researcher Dr. Gary Brucato has analyzed the behavioral patterns in cases like this one. Cases where elderly victims are taken from secured residential environments, where the perpetrators demonstrate operational awareness of the victim's routine, and where the initial response from the household creates more questions than it answers. His analysis points consistently to one finding. Crimes against elderly victims in private residences almost never involve strangers who got lucky. They involve access, specific, pre-established, trusted access. Think about what that means for Nancy Guthrie's Catalina Foothills home. A gated community environment, a residence that does not invite random foot traffic, an 84-year-old woman whose daily patterns were known, knowable only to people who had spent time in her orbit. Now think about the cell data. Sheriff Chris Nanos's investigators pulled the digital records, location data, device activity, the same kind of evidence that has broken cases wide open in courtrooms across the country because it does not negotiate, it does not misremember, and it does not protect anyone. The data placed activity in locations that did not match the accounts being given, not approximately, not in a way that could be explained by a confused timestamp or a misremembered sequence of events, directly contradicting. But that means someone controlled the narrative, not adjusted it, not softened the edges, controlled it from the foundation up, with the specific confidence of someone who understood that the first version of events, the one offered before investigators had the tools to check it, would carry the most weight in the early hours. Dr. Ann Burgess, one of the most respected criminal profilers in the country, the woman whose foundational research on criminal behavior helped build the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, has spoken about the profile of perpetrators in cases involving elderly victims and pre-planned abductions. They are calm, she explains. They do not improvise under pressure because they have already run the pressure in their heads before it arrives. They answer questions without appearing to calculate their answers. They maintain the emotional register of someone who is cooperating fully because they have decided in advance what full cooperation looks like. They do not panic. That behavioral detail, the absence of panic in the people closest to the situation during the early investigative window, was one of the most analyzed elements of the Nanos team's initial assessment. Panic is human. Its absence in circumstances this severe is a signal. Now here is where the technology piece matters, and it matters more than most people realize when they first encounter it. Cell tower triangulation works like this. Every time a device connects to a network, the nearest towers log the signal. Think of it as 3 spotlights aimed at the same stage from different angles. Where all 3 beams cross, that is where the phone is. Investigators can take that data, run it across a timeline, and produce a movement map that shows exactly where a device traveled and when. In Nancy Guthrie's case, that map contradicted the verbal accounts that had been offered. The circle narrowed. The location it narrowed to was not random. It was not a location that required specialized knowledge to access. It was a location that required familiarity, proximity, the kind of knowledge that comes from being in someone's life, not observing it from a distance. That is not random. That is targeted. Every piece of evidence stopped pointing outward. It was pointing somewhere familiar. And Derek Colella, the former Los Angeles County employee who sent that ransom text to Annie Guthrie, was now inside the investigation as a named individual. Not cleared, not on the periphery, inside it. Which raised the question that Nanos's team and the FBI were now working in parallel. Was Colella connected to the people who took Nancy, or was he connected to the people who knew where she was being kept? Because those are 2 different questions, and only one of them had been answered. It wasn't hidden well, it was hidden confidently. And confidence like that only comes from one thing, knowing that no one is looking at you. Whoever took Nancy Guthrie from her Catalina Foothills home had been in that world before, not guessing at it, not working from a distance with secondhand information, inside it, moving through it with the ease of someone who did not have to think about where the exits were, how the property sat relative to the street, what the sight lines looked like from the neighboring houses, or when the comings and goings of that household created a window of opportunity. They already knew. That knowledge does not come from surveillance. Surveillance still puts you on the outside looking in. Surveillance leaves gaps, uncertainties, moments where you have to guess because you cannot be fully certain. This operation had no visible gaps, which means this person, or these people, had a relationship with Nancy Guthrie's life that went past observation. Criminal profiler Dr. Ann Burgess has built an entire framework around what she calls the access architecture of targeted crimes against elderly victims. Her research, developed over decades of work with the FBI, and law enforcement agencies across the country points to a consistent finding. The perpetrator in cases like this one does not stumble into opportunity. They identify it, they cultivate it, they wait, and then they move with precision that only familiarity makes possible. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the access questions stack quickly. Who knew her Thursday appointments? Who knew the rhythm of her household well enough to identify when that residence would be at its most vulnerable? Who understood her routine at a level specific enough to time an abduction? Because make no mistake, what happened to Nancy Guthrie on or around February 1st, 2026 was timed, without producing the kind of disruption that would have triggered an immediate alarm. Not random access, not forced entry in the way that leaves a scene that screams for attention. Something cleaner, something that required the people who came into contact with that home in the hours surrounding Nancy's disappearance to have a reason to be there that would not, on its surface, cause concern. Familiarity was the mechanism, and that brings the investigation back, unavoidably, directly, to the people who occupied the last confirmed hours before Nancy was gone. Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni were cleared. That remains a fact, and it remains important. But genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, who has used DNA-based investigative techniques to break cold cases that had been sitting unsolved for decades, has spoken about the way family-adjacent cases require investigators to hold two things simultaneously: the legal determination, cleared, and the investigative reality that cleared individuals still carry information, relationships, and connections that may link to the people who are not cleared. Being cleared of direct involvement does not close the question of who had access through you. That is a harder thing to sit with, but it is the question that experienced investigators do not walk away from. Sheriff Chris Nanos's team, working alongside the FBI, has been mapping the relational network around Nancy Guthrie's life with exactly that understanding. Who moved through her world? Who had reason to be in that household? Who had knowledge of her routines and vulnerabilities that could have been, intentionally or without full awareness, transferred to someone who used it? And then there is Derek Kallela, a former Los Angeles County employee with no publicly established direct connection to Nancy Guthrie's household. And yet he sent a ransom text to Annie Guthrie. That text requires explanation. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer has been clear in her public analysis of this case. A ransom communication in the early window of a disappearance tells investigators something critical. The person sending it either has direct knowledge of the victim's location, or they have a connection to someone who does. Random opportunists do not typically identify the right family member to contact. They do not typically make contact before the full story is public. They do not typically demonstrate the kind of operational awareness that positions a ransom request as credible rather than immediately dismissible. Kalella's text was not immediately dismissible. That is why it is inside the active investigation. This wasn't chaos. This was timing. The kind of timing that required someone to know the family well enough to understand which name to reach out to, which daughter, which contact point would produce the response they were looking for. And Dr. Gary Brucato's behavioral research adds one more layer to this profile, one that does not get discussed enough in the public conversation around cases like this one. The people who plan crimes against elderly victims in private residences almost always account for the family response in advance. They anticipate who will call law enforcement and when. They anticipate what the family will say publicly and what they will try to keep private. They anticipate the emotional dynamics, the grief, the fear, the desire to protect, and they build those dynamics into their operational plan. Because family love, in cases like this one, is not just an emotional reality, it is a variable that can be used. Family plan. That phrase, the one that surfaced in the first hours, the one that was offered smoothly and early, the one that investigators wrote down because things that sound too reasonable always get written down, carries its full weight now. It was never about protecting Nancy. It was about managing what happened after Nancy was gone, coordinating the response, controlling the first version of events, ensuring that the people asking questions were pointed in directions that created time, precious, irreplaceable time, for the people who needed it most. This wasn't confusion. This was calculation. And the most dangerous part of this entire case, the part that forensic researcher Dr. Gary Brucato, profiler Dr. Ann Burgess, and former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer all circle back to in their independent analyses, is not what was done to an 84-year-old woman in the Catalina foothills on or around February 1st, 2026. It is who could do it, who could remain composed, who could participate in the public response, who could exist inside the grief of this story without their composure cracking in a way that felt real rather than managed. Who could do all of that without being questioned? Not once, not in the beginning, because they had already built the answer before the question arrived. Brian Entin said it plainly, not carefully, not with the layered qualifications of someone managing a broadcast relationship with law enforcement sources they need to protect. Plainly, the way a reporter speaks when the sourcing has moved past the point where careful language serves the story. He reported FBI activity in the Nancy Guthrie case, and then he said it, family plan. 3 words that had traveled through this entire investigation. First, harmless, offered in the opening hours as an explanation for communication decisions. Then suspicious, sitting against a backdrop of aligned statements and contradicted location data. Then heavy, carrying the full weight of everything the evidence had produced since. Landed differently when Brian Entin said them out loud on the record. Because Brian Entin does not speculate. His track record on missing persons cases is built on sourcing, on access, on the specific credibility that comes from being the reporter law enforcement calls when they want something in the public domain without it being traced directly back to them. When Brian Entin uses a phrase, it is because that phrase is already inside the investigation. Officially, Sheriff Chris Nanos's office states the investigation remains open and active. All leads are being followed. Evidence is being processed. No charges have been announced. The public language coming from official channels is measured, non-directional, careful. The standard operating register of a law enforcement agency building a case that has to hold under the pressure of a courtroom. But the investigative reality is not scattered, it is narrowing. The cell tower triangulation has collapsed the search radius to a specific area. The digital records have been subpoenaed and are being analyzed against the verbal accounts collected in the first 72 hours. Accounts that, as this investigation has shown, do not fully align with what the data says happened. The ransom text from Derek Colella to Annie Guthrie is inside the active federal investigation. And Savannah Guthrie, the daughter whose name and platform turned a Tucson area missing persons case into a national story within hours of going public, is no longer speaking in the language of hope alone. The $1 million reward still stands, but the tone surrounding it has changed. Because Savannah understands, as everyone close to this case now understands, that the search for Nancy Guthrie is not just about finding an 84-year-old woman who was taken from her home. It is about understanding the full architecture of what was built around her disappearance. Who built it, how long they had been building it, and what it says about the specific nature of the relationship between Nancy and the people who were supposed to protect her. C.C. Moore, the genetic genealogist who has used DNA evidence to identify perpetrators in cases that had been cold for decades, has noted publicly that cases like this one, where the investigative focus eventually turns inward toward the relational network surrounding the victim, almost always produce answers. The evidence exists. It always exists. The question is how long it takes for the right combination of digital records, behavioral analysis, and forensic data to produce the convergence that makes the picture undeniable. That convergence is happening now. Dr. Ann Burgess, in her decades of profiling work, has described the moment in an investigation when the profile and the evidence begin pointing at the same target. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with a dramatic break in the case. It arrives quietly in the accumulation of details that, individually, mean something, but together mean everything. The investigators in Pima County and the FBI agents working alongside them are in that accumulation right now. And former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, who has been among the most consistent public voices on this case, has said what the evidence has been building toward since the first questions were raised about the timeline. The answers are close. The original question, the one that launched the search, the one that put Nancy Guthrie's name in front of the entire country, the one that sent Savannah Guthrie to a camera to offer $1 million for her mother's safe return, was simple. Where is Nancy? The location is no longer the mystery it was, which means the question has shifted. It has shifted to who knew that location before the search began. Who shaped the first hours of information with the specific confidence of someone who understood that confidence, in those moments, was the only protection they had? Why that location was not in the first wave of the search? Not because investigators overlooked it, but because the information they were given was built to point them elsewhere. Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni were cleared. Derek Colella is inside the active investigation. Brian Entin is watching. Sheriff Chris Nanos is building. And the FBI does not commit federal resources to a case unless the case has earned them. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She tended a garden. She made her calls. She lived her life with the specific, quiet dignity of a woman who had earned every single day of the life she built. She deserved to be safe in her own home. She deserved to have the people around her choose her protection over their own. She deserved better than a family plan that served everyone except her. The search didn't end when they found the location. It ended when they realized it had never been lost. And the people who knew where she was the entire time, the people who built the response, managed the timeline, offered the phrases that sounded too reasonable to question, they are not outside this investigation anymore. They are inside it. If this story moved you, if Nancy Guthrie's name means something to you now that it did not before you press play, share this. Put it in front of someone who needs to see it. Every share keeps pressure on cases like this one, and pressure is what moves investigations forward when they need to move faster. Subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications right now. This case is still developing. There are details still surfacing, records still being processed, and questions still demanding answers. When the next break happens, and it will happen, this channel will be the first place it gets broken down clearly, completely, and without flinching. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This community shows up for every case covered here, and your voice matters more than you know. Sometimes the right comment reaches the right person at exactly the right moment. Nancy Guthrie's story is not over. Neither is this investigation.